Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Parent Institute this evening. I'll probably wait one more minute to give folks a chance to get into the Zoom meeting, and then we will get started. I did put a message in the chat. If you haven't already done so, I'd encourage you to grab some paper and something to write with so that you have it for any note-taking and reflecting that you might want to do during the presentation, and to refer back to when it's time for the question and answer period. Thank you. Okay, I think we are going to go ahead and get started. So I am going to share my screen with everyone. Okay, so hopefully you all can see the presentation. I'll wait for a thumbs up from my co-host just to be sure. Okay, got it, great. So the topic for this evening's Parent Institute is on microaggressions. And so the title is Microaggressions and How They Impact Our Students. And this is the first part of a three-part series that the district will be doing around anti-racism. And so we will have another session in October and then our third session in November. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for those two. Just a little bit about myself, if we haven't had a chance to meet. My name is Layson Smith. I'm the Director of Student and Community Engagement. That means I oversee two big initiatives in our district, one around social emotional learning and development, and the second one is work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've been with the district almost 5 years now. I'm originally from Columbus, and I have been doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work for over 10 years now in different forms. And I would say that all of the work that I have done has been in service to students. And so I really enjoy working with our staff here in the district to help them to be able to support our students. So what are our goals for this evening? The first goal is that we will define what microaggressions are, and hopefully you'll be able to name examples of actual microaggressions. Our second goal is to really understand the impact that microaggressions are having on our students, color, and our Bexley community as a whole. And our third goal is to develop strategies that can support you all in attendance in addressing microaggressions and really understanding why it's so important that microaggressions be addressed. So when we're having conversations like this, we know that sometimes it can be uncomfortable, and people can deal with that in a number of different ways. And so conversations I've been having similarly with staff, we have used this format known as Courageous Conversations, which is based on a book by the same name. The author is Glenn Singleton, and he asked us to do a couple of things as we're engaging in conversations around topics like these. And so I'm going to ask that we also do that this evening. So the first one is to stay engaged, which I know it can be hard because we're doing this over Zoom. It's already a little awkward for me because I like interacting with people when I am presenting. So I'm going to challenge all of us to stay engaged, to stay focused in on the conversation. Grab some paper, a writing utensil, jot down notes. There'll be times that I'll pause during the presentation so that you can reflect. And I would also encourage you to share any reflections that you're open to sharing in the chat. The chat will only be seen and moderated by myself and my co-host, Jill Abraham, who's our Chief Academic Officer. So feel free to share thoughts there, but also we would strongly encourage you to put questions in the chat because we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Secondly, as you're reflecting, really speak your truth. So think about I statements, think about how things impact and show up for you personally, and try to stay away from generalizing groups, and really reflect on how you're entering into this important conversation. The next one is experience discomfort. Again, these are topics that can be uncomfortable, and that's okay. We will get through this conversation and we will be okay, even if we are uncomfortable. And so I would encourage you to sit with that uncomfortableness. Again, maybe take a moment to reflect on why you're feeling uncomfortable. You know, maybe there will be an ouch moment where you think, oh, that's something that I've done or said before. And so instead of sitting with maybe a mistake that you've made in the past, think about how we can move this work forward and all work to be better in supporting each other in this community. The fourth one is own intent versus impact. A lot of times when people do or say something that does not land well with someone else, the response can be, oh, I didn't mean it this way, I meant. And what that really does is negate the impact that our words and actions have on people. And so sometimes we can't try to explain our way out of something because it still does not make the impact of those words go away. And so you'll see this come up again in the slides, this intent versus impact, and really moving away from that is kind of our go-to, and really owning the way that our words and actions might be impacting people in our lives. And then the last one is to expect and accept non-closure. Even with all the conversation that we might have this evening, we will not get to everything. We will not wrap this up with a pretty bow. That's one of the reasons why we're having a 3-part series, so that we can continue to engage in the conversations. I would encourage you to maybe share with a friend or a family member afterwards, but just know that there won't necessarily be closure around this, and this is work that the district is committed to, and we will continue to have these conversations. So speaking of the district commitment, I wanted to pull out that the district is committed to anti-racism work. And while this is work that we were doing before, I think with everything that's gone on, especially over the summer, in the country and in our own community, the need to accelerate this work has become even more important. So I just wanted to give a couple of examples of how those commitments are showing up. The first one is, a lot of you might be familiar with the Bexley Anti-Racism Project, and that's a coalition of POC, which stands for People of Color, and white allies who are current students or graduates of Bexley High School. And their mission is to actively combat racial inequality through education, mobilization, and amplification in order to support people of color in the Bexley community and nationwide. And I've had a chance to meet with several representatives from this group on multiple occasions. And at our first meeting with them and with 2 of our board members and our superintendent, they shared a lot about their experiences as students of color in our district. And one of the things they asked was that we educate students and teachers on microaggressions beginning in elementary school, because a lot of them had attended elementary school in our district and had experienced microaggressions. And they firmly believe that if these were conversations we were having with our students and with our teachers about what they are and why they should not happen, then that would help to minimize the microaggressions that happen in our district. And then one of the other things that they said that I thought was really important is that people constantly make remarks that they may not realize are hurtful and racist, like you look smarter with your hair straightened, or you don't get to be mad about racism because you aren't even fully Black, etc. So those are quotes directly from our students of color in our district. And so this just highlights why this work is so important. Secondly, most of you probably saw the Bexley City School Board of Education community letter that went out towards the end of June. And so I just wanted to highlight a couple of the things that they mentioned in that letter. They said, acknowledges the voices and expectations of our community in response to recent events that call on us to confront racism, not only through conversation, but also definitive action. And so for us as an education entity, part of that definitive action is conversation and education. And then they went on to say, we commit to prioritizing district action in the coming weeks and to working in direct partnership with our valued community advocacy organizations, the City of Bexley, and other community stakeholders in our process. And so you all are part of those stakeholders, and we're glad that you are participating in this process. So the next thing we're going to do is watch a video. We won't watch the whole clip, but we will watch some of it, and it's titled, Why Microaggressions Aren't So Micro. And this will give you an opportunity to do your first bit of reflection. So I would ask that you think about something that surprised you from the video, something that resonated with you, and then a new realization or a new perspective that you might have. And again, I'd encourage you to jot down some notes, and if you feel comfortable doing so, to put some of those reflections in our chat.
The tall guy, the fast girl, the smart student, the autistic kid. Why do we use these definitions? Why should a difference define you? Surely there is more to you than just one difference. Why should just one make you stand out? Students of color in a predominantly white school ask themselves these questions every day. In their case, it's, why should my race define me? This question is often spurred by various experiences with microaggressions. A quick Google search will yield the dictionary definition of microaggression, which states a statement, action, or incident, regarded as an instance of subtle, indirect, or unintentional discrimination against a marginalized group, such as a racial minority. Now, although this definition is logically thorough, it does not account for how significantly microaggressions affect students of color. They have the prefix micro attached, but any student of color could tell you that microaggressions feel like they're anything but micro. As students of color go through their days, they are faced with these microaggressions that hinder them from having the most positive high school experience possible. This should never be the case. This is the story of students of color in a predominantly white school where a major problem is microaggressions. Now, I want to show you exactly what it looks like to have to go through your day with microaggressions. So, allow me to take you through a day in the life of students of color in their predominantly white school. Let's take one student, for example. We'll call her Kayla. Kayla is an athlete, artist, scholar, and friend. Again, many other things can define a person other than their race. Now, when Kayla wakes up in the morning, she prepares for the day just like any other high school student. She wakes up, gets out of bed, eats some breakfast, and leaves to start her day. But as soon as Kayla steps through the door of her school, she changes the way she carries herself. For example, one morning, when I saw Kayla and her mom pull up in front of the school to drop her off, I saw Kayla hurriedly remove the scarf she was wearing from her head, as if to avoid appearing ghetto. Kayla essentially puts on a mask when entering into her predominantly white school because she's been taught that behaving in a way she's accustomed to at home is inferior to the much more professional demeanor she has to put on at school. This burden of a mask is faced for our students of color before any microaggressions are even experienced. During first period that day, my friend Ava and some of her friends are heading to their first period science class. As Ava and her friends are getting settled down and getting ready for class, I hear a white peer call out from across the room to Ava, "How do you keep your hair clean if you don't wash it every day?" You could hear a pin drop in that room after that question was asked. It was dead silent. And you could see that Ava was visibly overwhelmed. She felt like she was left on an island to fend for herself. This, ladies and gentlemen, is our first example of a microaggression. The white peer that asks Ava about her hair holds a subtle, disrespectful undertone that you can see as Ava awkwardly fidgets about and tries to figure out how to respond to this question. But the problem is, she doesn't know how to respond. She's stuck. And so the whole class turns their heads towards Ava and watches as she awkwardly stumbles through an explanation of why she only needs to wash her hair once a week. And now, Ava's morning is off to the worst start she could possibly imagine. Later that morning, my friend Dante and I are in our English class, where Dante raises his hand to answer a question he just knew he had the right answer to. But when Dante raises his hand, he slips up on his code switching momentarily. Code switching here is changing the way you speak based on your environment. Here, a predominantly white environment. See, Dante meant to say, the characters didn't wish to keep going because they knew that the journey would be too hard. But instead, he said, they didn't want to keep going because they knew it was about to be too hard, you feel me? As soon as Dante said this, the white peer sitting across from us said to him, "Why do you talk like that?" With this microaggression, Dante is stunned. He doesn't understand. This is how he speaks. This is how he's always spoken. Nothing has changed. And then Dante does something I will never forget. He pulls out a copy of his favorite essay titled, "Should Writers Use Their Own English?" by Rashawn Ashanti Young. And using this piece, he explains how the standard language ideology, or the belief in one set of language rules that everyone must conform to, dominates our society. And later that day at lunch, Dante tells me that he realized that white peer asked about his dialect because the standard or ideal in our society has been made synonymous with whites. It's funny how just one microaggression could yield such a heavy realization. After our lunch that day, our friend Will is in his music class, where he's confronted by a white peer who is shocked to hear that Will knows every single song off of Paramore's, an American rock band's, latest album. Now, anyone close to Will knows that he is the biggest fan of rock music, but he doesn't often talk about it. Mostly because when a fellow student of color sitting behind Will overhears this conversation, he says to Will, "Man, you listen to white people music." After school that day, I told Will that the issues don't just come from white students. And more importantly, the last time I checked, music didn't have a color. Finally, the bell rings, and our friend Tanya is sitting on the track and getting ready for her track meeting. Now, Tanya wasn't talking to anybody, and she was waiting and stretching to get ready for her meet, when a white peer from the opposing team comes up to her and says, "Well, I have no chance against you. You're clearly going to be faster." Confused? Tanya tells me that it just doesn't stop. It doesn't matter where she goes because microaggressions always seem to find a way to follow her. Tanya tells me that she can run from microaggressions all she wants, but ultimately, she thinks this is one race she can't win. By the time Kayla...
Okay, so we are going to stop there. Hopefully you were able to jot down some notes. Hopefully that gave you some perspective on what microaggressions are. She provided us with a couple of good examples. And I really like this video because she is a Black student talking about the experiences of Black students in a predominantly white school. And those students could be students just like our students of color here in Bexley City Schools. So she does share some definitions with us, and we're going to look at the definition of microaggressions now. So what are microaggressions? Everyday verbal and nonverbal environmental slights, snubs, or insults. And the thing to remember about microaggressions is that they are not just related to race, but for this presentation, we are talking about racial microaggressions. They can be intentional or unintentional. They communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to the targeted persons. And it's usually based solely upon their marginalized group membership. So again, it could be folks of color, it could be folks in the LGBTQ community, it could be based on religion, it could be based on ability or disability, but it usually is perpetrated towards folks who have some type of marginalized identity. And then racial microaggressions, of course, would be insults that are perpetrated against people of color, which is what our focus is for this evening. So why are microaggressions so hard to use? In that video, the student says, you know, microaggressions are not so micro. And so while on the onset, they might seem small, the way that they impact our students specifically are large. And so why are they so hard to see? Part of it is because they're so small, people usually feel like they can easily explain them away. And secondly, a lot of people consciously don't know that they are perpetrating microaggressions against other people until someone says to them, "Do you realize how this can be offensive?" They're cumulative. So if you think about the experience of perhaps a student of color in our district, let's say a high school student who is before COVID, switching classes and interacting with multiple students, there could be a microaggression made in one class, and then perhaps in the second class, and then in the hallway, perhaps in the cafeteria. And so while it might just be that one person made what we consider to be a microaggression, when you layer each one on top of each other, they have a huge impact on the life of our students of color. And again, they're perpetrated by many different people. So now we're going to talk about types of microaggressions. So the first type of microaggression is known as a micro assault. And so this is overt discrimination. It is usually conscious and intentional, verbal or nonverbal, and it is meant to hurt the intended victim through either name calling, avoidant behavior, or purposeful discriminatory actions. So we're going to go through all three types, and then I'll provide you with some specific examples. The second type of microaggression is a micro insult. And these can also be verbal and nonverbal, but they communicate more subtly with rudeness and insensitivity, and they demean a person's racial heritage or identity. It signifies that the person is a slight exception to what we normally consider to be a stereotype, They're not a compliment, although the person saying it might think that they're giving the other person a compliment. And I think you'll understand this better when we get to the examples. And then they signal to people of color that their contributions are unimportant. And then the last example, or excuse me, the last type of microaggression is a micro-invalidation. And so these communicate, again, subtly, exclusion, negate or nullify the thoughts of folks of color, their feelings, and their reality. They involve negating or ignoring the psychological thoughts, feelings, or reality of a person of color, and the comment or action that dismisses the experiences of historically disadvantaged group members. So I think you'll have a better understanding of the differences between these three when we look at some examples. So again, the micro assaults are the overt discrimination. And so some examples of those include proudly displaying, wearing, and/or defending the Confederate flag, using racial epithets, displaying swastikas, deliberately serving a white person before a person of color, perhaps in a restaurant, and then only calling on white students in a classroom. The examples of micro insults, so again, they signify that the person is a slight exception to the stereotype. So students of color might hear things like, you don't sound black, you don't act black, you're the whitest black person I know, I don't see color. The continuation of mispronouncing the names of students of color, especially when the correct name has been given on multiple times. The touching of hair, the comparing of skin tone, the assuming that if students of color have long hair that it must be fake, and then dismissing students in a class or ignoring them because of their identity. Oh, okay, so we're getting feedback that the slides are hard to see. Let me see how I can fix that. Can someone put in the chat if they're too small, or is it the color? Because maybe it's something that I can fix. I'll wait and see if someone puts something. They are blurry. Oh, that I don't know how to fix because they're clear. It's the size. Okay. All right, let me stop sharing my screen and see if I can fix this. Hold on just a minute. So the slides are smaller on my end, but I don't know that they are better on your end. So I will just read. I'm thinking it's just these slides with the words on it. So I will just read through these, and I apologize. And if you'd like a copy of something, then I can make sure and get that for you. Okay, so examples of micro insults, we just did that one. And so the last one is the examples of micro invalidation. And again, these dismiss the experiences of historically disadvantaged group members. So examples include go back to Africa, or no, where are you really from? And as you hopefully can see on your screen, some of the bullet points are in blue and some are in white. So at the beginning, I shared that there was a group of us from the district that met with students who are part of the Bexley Anti-Racism Project. And one of the big things that they talked about was microaggressions and the impact that microaggressions have on them as students here in Bexley City Schools. And they shared specific microaggressions that they had experienced as students in our district. So the ones that you see in blue are the microaggressions that our own students have experienced here in the district. So those would be seeing people proudly displaying, wearing, and or defending the Confederate flag, using racial epithets, being told that they don't sound Black, that they don't act Black, that they're very articulate, that they're the whitest Black person that someone knows, being told that that people they know don't see color, continuing to have their name mispronounced, having people reach out and touch their hair, having white people compare their skin tone to their own skin tone, the assumption that if they have long hair, that their hair is fake, and then being told to go back to Africa. So I thought it was really important that you all hear the voices of our students, because sometimes we can think things like microaggressions or racism are problems happening to other people. And so we just want to be clear that these are issues that we're having in our own community. And that's one of the reasons why these conversations are so important. And so I just want you to take a minute, maybe jot down on that paper that you grabbed at the beginning, and think about what the impact of racial microaggressions on our students of color might be. So I would encourage you to take a minute to jot down some notes on your paper. And then if you feel comfortable doing so, we would love to have your thoughts shared in the chat also. So I'll give you a minute to be able to do that. So we do have some folks sharing in the chat. Thank you. One of the participants said that our students of color would be exhausted, that the feeling would be heavy and alienating. Another person shared that they're thinking about the impact in a classroom, that these students are constantly auditing or editing the thoughts, comments, contributions to class. And that is very true. And that makes me think about this idea around code switching, and how for a lot of people of color, and even if our students of color can't put a name on it, they know that their behavior perhaps at home has to look different than their behavior in the classroom. And so they're constantly monitoring what they're doing or what they're saying to make sure that they have what could be deemed more appropriate behavior. Someone else said they could feel depression, self-doubt, They could feel alone, frustrated. I think the feeling of feeling alone is really important. I think for a lot of our students, they could feel like this is just happening to them. And even though all of the increase in racial injustice that we've now seen, even though we knew it was there before, one of the good things that I think has come out of that is more people of color, and specifically our students, talking about their experiences, which will help with that feeling of not feeling so isolated. Let's see, someone else said it would make our students of color feel alienated, again, hurt, misunderstood. They don't feel like they can be their true selves. Yes, yes, yes. And then someone else said our students of color feel less than, and they never feel equal. They feel like they have to work twice as hard to be perceived as being half as good. It can be very lonely for students of color. Yes, yes, yes. These are all great thoughts. Someone said, I think of code switching as also being multilingual, and it's exhausting. I would agree with that. I'm always fascinated to watch some of our students of color, especially our Black students, so effortlessly code switch when they go perhaps from the cafeteria to talking to a teacher. And in my mind, one of the things I think is they have really mastered that. And yet they probably have no idea the impact that that's having on them. So yes, yes, yes. Thank you all for your feedback. I really appreciate that. Just a couple things, and most of these are probably things that you have already said. Let's see. So the cumulative effect reminds people of color that they're less than, which someone shared in the chat. And it does do real psychological damage. There's a constant reminder that you don't belong, that you are less than, that you're not worthy of the same respect that white people are afforded. And it really does normalize racism. It just kind of makes it part of the culture. And it makes those racist assumptions a part of everyday life. It causes isolation and invalidation, which was mentioned in the chat. And then there's this inability to predict where and when microaggressions might happen. And so that leads folks of color to be very hypervigilant, which can lead to anxiety and depression, and is a lot for folks of color in general, and even more for our students of color. So again, the impact of racism on mental health, because microaggressions are connected to racism. A lot of these we've already talked about, this worry, this feeling of powerlessness, this panic, maybe some decreased hope, really second guessing yourself in terms of what you're able to do and not to do. So the question now is, what can you do and what should you be doing? And these questions are especially important for white people as you're working to show up to be allies for people of color. So the first thing I'm going to say is to breathe, because we have to acknowledge that these conversations can be hard, that talking to your friends or family can be hard to call out these microaggressions. But the important thing to remember is that we can't let conversations about microaggressions get derailed because of silence, or because of the feeling of uncomfortableness, or because of our own defensiveness. The analogy I like to use is, while you might be uncomfortable either addressing a microaggression, or you might be uncomfortable because someone has said that you have said a microaggression, that uncomfortableness is nothing compared to the daily microaggressions and racism that our students of color have to face. So the comparison there is none. And so really thinking about that as you're sitting with this uncomfortable feeling is really important. We read a book, the leadership team for the school district read a book, So You Want to Talk About Race, over the summer. And I pulled this quote out of there. She was talking about her experience with microaggressions, and again, feeling like it was only happening to her. And it wasn't until she is biracial, I believe she identifies as Black, but it wasn't until she was in a space with mostly folks of color that she realized the different treatment that she had been getting. And she says, but as painful as it was, I didn't know that it was wrong. I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to be treated this way. I was pretty sure that I was the problem because nobody came to my defense. Hell, nobody batted an eye when these things were said to me. And so again, what is your role as an ally to speak up for folks of color and to speak up specifically for students of color? So what are some ways that you can react when you hear or see microaggressions happening? So an option could be to let it go. The silence could keep you out of a potentially uncomfortable conversation, but the silence could place an emotional tax on Black people and other people of color. Also, the silence helps to reinforce the belief that Black people and other people of color are not safe from having their identity devalued. And sometimes for BIPOC folks, which that stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color, the silence could be protection. And so as a person of color who's navigating through a predominantly white space, you don't always want to take on the ownership of addressing microaggressions, which again is why it's so important to have allies in non-folks of color. Another way to react could be to respond immediately. It would allow the transgression to be called out and its impact explained while the details of the incident are fresh in the minds of everyone who's involved and everyone who's around to hear it. It models for others that when things like this happen, we call it out and address it. And it also models for others that we don't tolerate that type of behavior. It speaks to the climate and culture that we're working to create. And it can be risky. The last option in terms of, well, not the last option, but another option could be to respond later. So maybe wait until it's just you and the other person who said the microaggression. So the perpetrator of the microaggression will have to recall the incident. And so you'll have to spend some time. Remember when you said this thing here, I want to talk to you about it. But it also might be able to help save face in terms of minimizing the defensiveness that might happen had you address the microaggression immediately during the time that it actually happened. So strategies to address microaggressions, a couple of things. It's really important to state what actually happened, using the words that the person used so that they know what the problem was. And you'll need to ask some questions because again, if you remember earlier in the presentation, I talked about the fact that sometimes microaggressions are unintentional because folks don't realize that the things that they're saying are microaggressions and or racist. And so you might have to ask some clarifying questions, which could be uncomfortable to the person who committed the microaggression. And then I would encourage you to ask some more uncomfortable questions because again, we can't learn and do better if we're not engaging in these conversations. Reinforce that good intentions are not the point. So again, a lot of times people will say, you know, but I have good intentions, or what I intended was fill in the blank. And that is not the point. The point is the impact that the microaggression has had on a person of color. And then this last one, remember you're not crazy and you have every right to bring it up. So sometimes as folks of color, you know, we might say, well, that teacher made a comment about my hair, right? And so that one little comment might seem pretty small, but we can't, so then as the person tries to explain it away, as a person of color, you might think, oh my gosh, maybe I've made too big of a deal about this, right? And so we don't want that to happen. We want folks to know that if you feel like a microaggression has been committed against you, it's okay to speak up and say something. So I'm gonna go to the chat. Okay, so someone is saying that they struggle with the public nature of microaggressions, but often the correction or resolution is often very private. In essence, public humiliation is greater than the resolution, and that seems harmful to the victim of the microaggressions. I totally agree 100%. If I had to pick which one of those things on the slide is the way that you address the microaggression, I would say you do it right then and there. And that's definitely the message that we give to teachers. Because what happens is other students in that space think that that thing is okay. And we want to make sure that we're creating a culture and climate where folks know that that's not okay. I would say perhaps people might go the route of doing a private conversation, perhaps if it's a family member, or if you're just kind of dipping your toe in the water in addressing these types of things, right? And so you might say, okay, I really need to say something. Okay, I can't do it right now. I'm going to wait and say something later. But I think if we're going to create the type of climate and culture we want to be able to support our students and our staff of color here in Bexley City Schools and in the city of Bexley, we're going to have to start to have the conversations publicly. And I'll give a couple of different ways that we can do that. But thank you for putting that in the chat. So one of those ways actually is just to be an interrupter, because again, sometimes people don't realize that the things that they're saying are hurtful or demeaning to folks of color. So here's a list of ways that you can just kind of pause the conversation and get the person who has said the microaggression to stop. Because there is a chance, not all the time, but there is a chance that just stopping that conversation and giving that person a chance to reflect is all that they'll need to realize, oops, what I said was problematic and I shouldn't have said it. So I would encourage you to look at this list and think about what are a couple of these little short sentences that you can have in your pocket just to help interrupt the conversation and get the person to think about what it is that they're saying. So that's not okay with me. I didn't realize you think that. I'm sorry, what? Hold on, I need to process what you said. If it's a joke, just simply saying, that's not funny. Or saying, I find that offensive. What you said is harmful. We don't say things like that here. That's a really good interrupter statement for teachers to use in the classroom with students. Help me understand your thinking. So give the person who said the microaggression a chance to process through what they've said and why. I'm not comfortable with that. Again, I'd encourage you just to take a couple of these to help interrupt those conversations. Now I'm going to go back to the chat. Oh, people are adding more things in here that would be good to respond. So someone said, if you don't know exactly what to say, start by saying something like, what you said or did can be hurtful too, and it's not okay. Yes. Someone said, I'm wondering if you are aware of how I heard that. So then maybe you repeat it back to that person. And then, of course, the person might say, oh, I didn't intend, what I meant was, and then that will give you an opportunity to talk about the impact that that phrase had. Let's see, someone said, as a white person, I like to believe that I'm alert to what I'm saying, but I sometimes say something I wish I hadn't. I believe I need to own it promptly and publicly so that other whites see what owning it looks, sounds, and feels like. Yes, yes, and yes. That is practicing your allyship publicly. And that is what will help us to begin to shift the culture and climate around microaggressions and racism. All right, let's jump to, so advice for white people working towards allyship. And this goes along with what's happening in the chat. So again, I've said this multiple times. Remember that intent does not supersede impact. Seek to understand the experiences of your BIPOC, remember, Black, Indigenous, people of color, peers, friends, co-workers, etc., and employees without making them responsible for your edification. Believe BIPOC people when they choose to share their insights. Don't get defensive and don't play devil's advocate. And then get comfortable rethinking much of what you have thought to be true about the world and your communities, and accept that you have likely been complicit in producing inequity and racism. Okay. So how do I use this understanding in my own home and community? And some of this showed up in the chat, so some of you all are already on it. First, asking for more clarification. So you might say something like, could you say more about what you mean by that? Or you could say, how have you come to think that, right? So again, really getting the person who said the microaggression to think about what they said. Separate the intent from the impact. Because again, a natural defensive mechanism for folks is to say, I didn't mean, or that wasn't my intention. And so you might say something like, I know you didn't realize this, but when you said or did blank, it was hurtful and offensive because fill in the blank. Instead, you could, and then give them a suggestion of a different language they could use or a different behavior that they could have done. Share your own process. There are folks in the chat who are identifying as white folks and saying, you know, this is what my processes look like. This is what I've done. And I think as an ally to model that for other white people can be extremely helpful. So you might say, I noticed that you, again, fill in the blank with the comment or the behavior. I used to do or say that too, but then I learned fill in the blank with what you learned around why that behavior or comment is problematic. Okay, so although I like to think that we'll all leave this presentation and none of us will ever commit another microaggression, I also know that that probably won't happen. So what are some things you should remember when you've committed a microaggression? Pause. Again, remember that breathing. It's very important. Don't derail the feedback with defensiveness. And I know that that will be uncomfortable and you will get through it. Don't force people to acknowledge your good intentions. It's not about you. It's about the impact that you have had on a person of color. Ask yourself, do I really know why I said or did that? For a lot of people, we need to unlearn some things that we have learned, either growing up or even as adults. You know, our learning continues, but we also have to take some opportunities to unlearn some things. Ask yourself, would I have said this to somebody of my own race? Is it something that I say to people of my own race? Ask yourself if you were feeling threatened or uncomfortable in this situation, and then ask yourself why. Really process through that. Again, there might need to be some unlearning. There might need to be some thinking about implicit bias and how your implicit biases are playing into the situation. And this is where I'll plug our October Parent Institute, because it will be all about implicit biases. So hopefully you'll come back and join us for that. And remember, it's not just this one incident. Even though it might just be this one incident for you, for people of color, it is multiple incidents. And so you have to be cognizant of that, because sometimes I know that white people can feel like, I'm not sure why they made such a big deal about that. Nope. It might have been a microaggression, but they are cumulative, and we have to remember that. And then research further on your own time. I know sometimes it can be tempting to want folks who are experiencing microaggressions or racism to enlighten you, but Google is our friend. And so there are podcasts and books and articles and just all types of things out there that can help you in terms of your research. We have a question on when will the elementary students get microaggression training? That is something that we are working on with our principals and our counselors. We are starting with our staff so that our staff can be comfortable in having these conversations and then be able to move those conversations in with our students. Very good point. Someone says, as a white person who desires to be an interrupter, it's important to also pay attention to whether or not the person of color wants my help, right? So in being an ally, it doesn't mean that you have to swoop in and save folks of color, right? You might say, hey, do you want some help with this? Or if you see the person of color's already got it, they're addressing it, then you're fine to step back. And this person says it takes some sensitivity and really being attuned to the moment. And I would definitely agree with that. And then if you've committed a microaggression, apologize. Own your mistake, apologize for it, learn from it, and work to do better in the future. One of the things I think is really important as we have these conversations is thinking about how you will keep yourself and others accountable to this important work. So I would encourage you to write down the words start, stop, and keep doing. So what is something that you've learned from this session that you will start doing? What is something that perhaps you're doing that you need to stop doing? And then what is something that you're doing perhaps as an ally that you'd like to continue doing? And then really think about how will you keep track and hold yourself accountable? Do you know of a friend who's also on this presentation who you can have as an accountability buddy? Or perhaps someone in your family or a colleague that you have that you could talk to about this presentation and ask them to be your accountability buddy. I would really challenge you to think about how you will hold yourself accountable to doing this work after you leave this presentation. Let's see. So a person of color says, as a person of color, I find it hard to remain patient with allies, in quotes, who swoop in as a savior and cause even more harm. Yes, I think that goes back to what the previous person was saying who identified as white, that you have to really be in tune to what is happening. And then this person goes on to say, I've had someone lecture me all the while spewing microaggressions. Yes, sometimes you just have to know when to stop talking. It's very, very important. Okay, so we're gonna watch one more really short video and then we'll move into the Q&A session. Let's see here.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
Oh, you're so well spoken.
just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while,
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date,
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
going grocery shopping,
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
commuting to work,
So when are you gonna have a baby?
watching TV,
We have to keep the Redskins name. It's part of our culture and history.
or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? Give me shopping advice. I love Cher too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every goddamn day,
Can I touch your hair?
multiple times a day,
So pretty. Can
Can I touch
your
it,
hair,
please?
please?
Can I please?
is fucking annoying. And makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes, which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares?
Just another angry black woman.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try less challenging, Major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
He looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
All right, so excuse the language. I thought we're all adults. We can handle this. That's not a video that we would show to the children. Let's see, I think we are, okay. So we are officially to the Q&A and reflection part, although I feel like I got most of the questions as they were coming up, just because it seemed to make sense just to go ahead and ask them while people were asking them in the moment. I do want to put my contact information up here. I'm sure if you all are parents in the district, you can reach me. My information's on our website. There's my email address, and then I also have a Twitter handle that I try to share out articles and information on. So I am going to stop the screen sharing. There we go. Okay. And then I'm going to open up the chat again and see what we have here. Just a second to get organized. Okay.
Lisan, we have a
Yes, go ahead. Yes, hi, Jill.
Hi there. We have a couple of questions with some specific examples that maybe you could speak to. So let me share those with you.
Okay.
One of the examples you gave of a microaggression was, I don't see color. I grew up being taught not to see color. Why is that bad?
Okay, great question. First of all, thank you for acknowledging that you may need to unlearn something. So I know for a lot of people, they learned that saying I don't see color and I treat everyone fairly, kind of connecting those two sentences, was okay. Not seeing color dismisses the identity of people of color. So who I am, my experiences, how I walk through the world, all of that is determined by my multiple identities. So whether we're thinking about my race, my gender, my socioeconomic status, my sexual orientation, all of that, all impacts the person that I am and makes me who I am. And so when we say we don't see color, number one, unless you're colorblind, it's not true. You see color. And number two, it dismisses a very important identity for folks of color. And so it's okay. I know, for some folks, they grew up thinking that acknowledging race or talking about race was not okay. And again, it's part of shifting the culture. It's okay to talk about race. It's okay to acknowledge it. In a book that I read, the author gave the example of like going in the grocery store with your child. So maybe you have like a 2-year-old, let's say you're a white person, white parent with a child, and the child sees a person of color and says like, look, mommy, there's a brown person. And it might be the parent's inclination to shush the child and say, no, don't say, so we are sending these messages at a very young age that we don't talk or acknowledge race. And I would challenge us to think differently about that, because our race and ethnicity is part of our experiences in the world.
Okay, and then building off of that, a second example was the example of saying something like, you're very articulate. Can you explain why that would be seen as bad?
Yeah, so saying that someone is articulate on the surface is not bad. And if you are describing multiple people, and that's a phrase that you would use for multiple people, whether they be folks of color or white people, that's fine. How it shows up as a microaggression, for some white people, rarely do they describe another white person as articulate. That phrase as a microaggression is put on folks of color almost as a disclaimer to say, this particular person of color is actually very articulate. And it makes the assumption that perhaps a group, folks of color in general, are not articulate. So because that's the bias that I have in my head, I want to make sure that you know that this specific person is articulate, right? And so again, that's another example of something people say that they think is a compliment. And oftentimes it's only directed as folks of color, and it's not directed at white people, which is where it becomes the microaggression.
Okay, another question that you have, are staff in the district receiving the same kind of learning opportunity or something similar to it?
Yes. So I oversee our district-wide school climate committee, and one of the ways that they really help me in this work is to get it back into the buildings and make sure that our staff receive training. And so we've been doing that since I started in the district 5 years ago. Actually, this year, what we're doing is providing professional development opportunities, and not really opportunities, staff have to participate, for our staff on a monthly basis. And so we actually started the week before the students returned. I did a presentation for every building around anti-racism, around what it is, around white privilege, and around our commitment to anti-racism and what that would look like for our school year. From there, we have a partnership with the College of Education at Ohio State, and they have provided us with some great implicit and I'm forgetting the other word, but some bias modules. And so I've started those modules with our leadership team, and we will actually start those with our staff. There are 6 parts to those. Those will start in our buildings next week. We'll do the first building, and then we'll do some more work on our PD Day in October. We'll continue to do more work, our PD Day in November. And then we also offered multiple sessions during the summer. A lot of those were voluntary, but we had a really good turnout from those summer sessions from teachers who just wanted to be a part of the conversation and get the learning. So we are definitely working to make sure that this learning is happening with our teachers also. Jill, did you have another question?
I'm letting some people type in here, so we'll
Oh, okay, let me look. Okay.
Layson, what suggestion would you give to parents or grandparents or family if their children or grandchildren come home and say that they've experienced a microaggression while at school, whether it was from a peer, a teacher, it could be a coach? What would you suggest they do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the things that's important as a school district, again, is that we start to shift the culture so that it doesn't get all the way home and that's the first time that the student is talking to someone about it. I think what I would like to see is that students feel comfortable going to someone in the building. Usually when I get a chance to talk to students, one of the questions I'm always asking them is, who is your adult in the building? Like if something were to happen right now and you needed to talk to someone, who is that person that you can go to? And sadly, for some of our students, they can't come up with a person right away, which is why the relationship building piece with students is so important. But if it is that the student gets home and that's the first time that they're sharing it with an adult, I would definitely encourage the adult to call the school. Like, we need to know what is happening, and we need to be able to address those things. So whether that be with a teacher, and the adult doesn't necessarily have to call the person that committed the microaggression. Like we can take ownership of that. But let's say perhaps it happened in a specific class, but you call the homeroom teacher. Then the homeroom teacher can have a conversation with the principal, or you can call the principal directly. I would say as a leadership team, we are working to learn, to unlearn, to hold ourselves accountable, and to hold our staff accountable. The other way, if you do not want to talk to a person, thank you for the person who put it in the chat, is that we have our online incident reporting form. And that goes directly to the principal, but I also get a copy of each form that comes through. And so if you felt more comfortable documenting that in writing, you could go to our website, and on our front page, there's a bullying and harassment link, and you could have that documented on that form. And then the principal would have to look into the incident, and they would get back to you on the findings of what happened and make sure that it was addressed with whoever was involved in it.
We've got another comment and question. I've heard that as a white person, I shouldn't compliment a Black woman's hair, that's a microaggression. Is that true? And if so, why?
So that's a tricky one. That's kind of like the your very articulate one. Again, it's not about the complement of the hair. And I actually had this conversation in one of the buildings when we were doing the training the week before school started. What can often happen is that our students of color will wear their hair natural, so in their natural state, how it grows out of their hair, perhaps head, perhaps it's really curly, and they'll get no compliments. And then that same student will make the decision to straighten their hair, and when they come to school the next day, they will receive multiple compliments from white people. And so what that does is it reinforces this ideal of beauty that in order for it to be nice hair, or in order for you to be considered pretty, you need to conform to the standards of beauty, which of course would be white, perhaps blonde, perhaps straight hair. So it's not about the compliment, it's about what our students of color have to go through in order to get that compliment. And so hair is a very touchy subject. We see our students of color wearing their hair in all kind of fabulous ways, and that's great. And sometimes it can be tempting for folks to want to reach out and touch or ask questions, and the touching of folks' body parts, whether it's hair or anything else, is not okay. And making those compliments when they're really based on standards of beauty from white women is definitely a microaggression.
Some of the examples that you shared don't seem mean. I almost feel like I can't say anything without fear of offending someone.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful not to get caught up in, well, I can't say anything without offending people. That is certainly not the point, that we just now don't want people to talk because they might offend someone. And when you take that stance, again, you're making it about you and less about the other person. So we want to be able to engage with folks who are different than us, who have different backgrounds, different races and ethnicities. We want to do that in a respectful way, and sometimes we might make mistakes, and we have to be okay with that. And it's less about, well, let me not say anything because I don't want them to get offended, because again, you're putting the ownership on the other person and not taking on your own ownership in terms of what you might have said or done. So I think it's just important to keep engaging in the conversations and not get so caught up about whether or not you may or may not offend someone. And again, if you have other questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat.
Layson, there's a lot of interest in regards to how to access this presentation after this evening.
And I will work with our public information officer to make that available. We have a landing page connected to the website. Like if you go on the search and type in Parent Institute, it'll take you to the Parent Institute landing page. And so I'll work with Tyler to figure out how to get the presentation on that page. Let's see, someone in the chat says, it seems to me that when people say I don't want to offend others, it really means I am unable or unwilling to experience my own discomfort. Yes, again, you are making it about yourself and about you wanting to make sure that you are protected and comfortable. And that's just not the way we should be operating in the world. We need to be owning up to our own uncomfortableness. And we also need to be caring about folks in our lives and being okay with being uncomfortable if it means that we are being a better ally to folks of color. Right, we'll wait another minute or two. We won't hold you if we don't need to. And again, you have my email address. You can feel free to reach out to me at any time too. And you all are very welcome. Thank you for being here. I see the thank yous in the chats. All right, so we're starting to get all the good thank yous. Oh wait, I think we're getting another question. Okay, so the question is, hold on, it just went away. I think you might have kind of just answered this, but can you give recommendations on how to have open conversations on race while trying to not accidentally make microaggressions? So the first thing I would say is that we can't let the fear part of these conversations hold us back. Because if we're able to have these conversations, especially with our younger students, we will impact the way the world looks 5, 10, 15 years from now. The second thing I would say is think about how do we start to normalize conversations around race. I think that's the starting point, that we're talking about race, that we're, do you notice that this person is brown or this person is white, or perhaps you have people in your life where you can just refer to that. I think books are another awesome way to be able to do that. And we're lucky now that there are so many books made specifically for children that either talk about race, or that at least, even if race is not the center of the conversation, have different races and ethnicities as part of the people who show up in the book, that allow for other opportunities. And I think to also let our kids ask those questions, to make those comments, to not make them feel bad if they mention race, or if they ask a question. A kid might ask a question that is inappropriate or that we would consider a microaggression, but taking that moment to have the conversation with them and not shut that down, I think, so that you can continue to have that dialogue with your kids is super important. So I would encourage you to keep having those conversations. All right. So again, I would say if you have other questions or comments, you know how to reach me. I truly appreciate your time on this Wednesday evening. And again, I would encourage you to check out the Parent Institute page on our website. The October and November dates are on there. And thank you for your participation. Everyone have a great evening, and I look forward to seeing you soon.